The Boervolk journey, from martyrs to republic to remnant, it all began with the Edict of Worms and connecting it to the spiritual and historical persecution of what would later be known as Boervolk. Europe plunged into darkness, Christians and Bibles were burned, families were slaughtered. Hope seemed lost for those who believed in the God of heaven. In 1651, Jan van Riebeck, a corrupt company man, was sent to establish a supply station as punishment for fraud in 1651. Behind him stood the same powers that once persecuted the faithful. The company man Jan van Riebeck stepped onto the shores of the southern tip of Africa on the 6th of April 1652. Sent by the Dutch East India Company, his task was to build a refreshment station, a resting place for ships, not a refuge for souls. The sea was calm, but the mission was not. This was no sanctuary. It was a gateway for slavery, trade, and control. Yet even here, God would plant a seed that would later become the Boervolk. The VOC men could not tame the soil that was hard. The wind blew, the rains unpredictable. The seeds they carried did not take root. Oxen grew thin, sheep perished in the veld, hunger spread through the camp like a quiet enemy. The company man, Jan van Riebeck, returned to Holland to report to the 17 lords of the VOC. They listened in silence. Then came their answer. Europe no longer wants these Christians. Let us offer them freedom with hidden chains. A sound of hope echoed across a broken Europe, a continent that had hunted its own, where those who bore the name of Christ were dragged through blood and fire. But now, a whisper moved through the alleys of Geneva, across the rivers of the Rhineland, and into the stone churches of the Dutch Republic. There was talk of a distant land, wild, unclaimed, waiting, a land where the soil had not yet been stained with the blood of martyrs, where families could kneel without fear, lift their eyes to heaven and begin again. The persecuted, weary and scattered, heard the call, a place to worship, to build, to raise children in peace. And so the Protestants, the Lutherans and the Huguenots began to board ships, their faces set like flint toward the unknown. They left behind ancestral homes, familiar fields, and parents too frail to make the voyage. They wept, prayed, and sailed carrying with them only what they could not leave behind, their faith, their hope, and the dream of freedom. Thus began the great crossing not only of seas but of destiny. As soon as they set foot on the unfamiliar shores, the Protestants, the Lutherans, and the Huguenots fell to their knees. There, on windswept beaches under open skies, they formed prayer circles, men, women, and children lifting trembling hands to the God of heaven. With voices full of gratitude and hearts still aching from all they had left behind, they gave thanks for safe passage and new beginnings. Together, they dedicated this land untamed and full of promise, as a land of hope, set apart for the glory of God. Theirs was not a conquest but a covenant, a sacred offering of the soil beneath their feet to the one who had carried them through the fire. Over time, the rule of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, grew heavy-handed. Farmers, once filled with hope for freedom and provision, found themselves shackled by unfair practices. Grain, mutton, and beef were bought at meager prices set by the very company that claimed to protect them. When the British arrived, their laws deepened the burden. New regulations allowed the Khoisan and Xhosa to remove livestock directly from God, fearing farmers without permission and without consequence. The farmer, stripped of the right to defend his livelihood, was forced instead to travel to the distant company courts, wasting precious time and resources in a system tilted against him. What had begun as a covenant with the land had now become a quiet struggle for survival against paper laws, foreign judges, and the slow erosion of justice. Piet Retief wrote what so many believed: "We leave not in rebellion but in righteousness. If we cannot serve God freely, we must go where he leads." Declaration of the farmers departing from the colony of the Cape of Good Hope. We, desiring to remove ourselves from the rule of the British government and church, feel justified in recording the reasons for our departure. We complain of the severe losses we have suffered by the emancipation of our slaves and the vexatious laws made for their protection laws, which, in our opinion, are in direct opposition to the interests of us as a people. We complain of the continual system of plunder which we have endured from the natives and other colored classes, and the unjustifiable neglect with which we have been treated by the government and church in failing to afford us protection. We complain of the severe losses we have been compelled to sustain by frequent natives and incursions into the interior. We complain of the unjust and unconstitutional proceedings and decisions of the local courts. We complain of the absence of any adequate protection for life and property in the remote districts of the colony. We complain of the absence of any adequate protection for life and property in the remote districts of the colony. We complain of the continual increase of taxes and the total inefficiency of the means for education and religious instruction. We are resolved, wherever we go, that we will uphold the just principles of liberty. But while doing so, we will not permit the existence of slavery. We will endeavor to establish a government that shall be independent and just, and in which every man shall enjoy the fruits of his labor. The British authorities, government officials, church leaders and clergy alike grew increasingly resentful toward the steadfast frontier farmers who refused to bow to their rule. These were men and women of deep conviction, unwilling to compromise their faith or their freedom. In an act both cunning and cruel, a missionary was dispatched ahead of the ox-wagon caravans, galloping on horseback into the interior. His orders were clear: to sow distrust, to spread confusion. "If you see any great wagon trek approaching," he warned the tribes, "you may plunder and destroy. These people are not your friends. They are rebels, outcasts, practitioners of witchcraft." Thus, the faithful pioneers were branded as enemies, not only of the crown, but of the very people they sought to live among in peace. Betrayed before they even arrived, they pressed onward, carrying with them not weapons of conquest, but the hope of a land where truth and justice might prevail. As the faithful farmers journeyed inland, they found vast stretches of open land, rolling hills, rivers and valleys, untouched by the hand of man. It was not a wilderness devoid of life, but rather a land scattered with small, scattered communities, pockets of people living quietly across the terrain. When the farmers sought to settle and purchase land lawfully, they did not seize or demand, but asked with respect. One such community directed them to the powerful kingdom of Zululand, saying, "Go to Dingane, the Zulu king. This land is under his shadow." And so, with a spirit of peace and order, Piet Retief was chosen to lead the delegation, a company of 700 men, women and children. Families of faith, not conquest, made the journey eastward, bearing no flags of war, only hope for a place to sow, to build and to worship in freedom. In the courts of the Zulu king, shadows moved before the farmers ever arrived. British missionaries, cloaked in piety but driven by empire, whispered into the ears of Dingaan. "These farmers," they said, "do not come in peace. They are cursed men, rebels who defy the crown. They practice strange rites, witchcraft. Beware them." Their words, though soft, carried the weight of deception. What the king heard was not the truth of faithful families seeking a home, but a warning spun from fear and politics. And so mistrust took root, long before the first handshake, long before the ink dried on any agreement. The seeds of betrayal had already been sown. The land, what would later be known as the Natal, was formally granted by King Dingaan to the faithful farmers. The agreement was marked with a simple X, the sign of acknowledgement in the absence of letters, and perhaps an omen. For no sooner had the ink dried than betrayal crept in like a thief at night. On Dingaan's command, the warriors descended. Retief and his delegation were seized and slaughtered, without trial, without mercy. What followed was worse still. Over 750 men, women and children were hunted and massacred in the night. Fires consumed ox wagons, blood soaked the land. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of such injustice, and from the heavens the silence broke. For the God of heaven, who watches the affairs of men, does not overlook the blood of the innocent. The blood of the first martyred for their faith was spilled on the soil of southern Africa. When news of the massacre reached Andries Pretorius, it spread like wildfire across the veld. Mourning fell upon the land. Families grieved, mothers wept, and strong men, God-fearing men, fell to their knees, their hearts broken with sorrow and burning with righteous anger. This was no ordinary loss. It was betrayal sealed in blood. And from the ashes of tragedy, a cry rose among the faithful, a solemn call not for vengeance but for justice. Pretorius answered that call. So did many others, men willing and able to stand, not with hatred but with holy resolve. They gathered not as conquerors but as defenders, not to destroy, but to draw a line in the soil of a land now consecrated by the blood of martyrs. They prayed, they prepared, and they marched under heaven's gaze and with covenant in their hearts. Upon arriving in Zululand, Andries Pretorius surveyed the land, and what he saw shook even the heart of a seasoned man of war. Before him, spread across the hills and valleys, stood an army of 30,000 Zulu warriors. Shields and spears in the sun, war chants echoed like thunder. The air was heavy with the scent of battle. Pretorius knew in the depth of his soul that by human strength alone they could not win. Outnumbered, outmatched, and with the memory of the slain still fresh in their minds, he turned not to strategy but to the heavens. "We need divine help," he declared. "If God is not with us, we will fall. But if he is for us, none can stand against us." And so, on the eve of battle, the men gathered in solemn prayer from the 8th to the 15th of December 1838. A covenant was made, not in arrogance but in humility. They pledged that if victory was granted, they would build a house for God, celebrate the day as a day of thanksgiving, and tell of God's faithfulness to every generation. With hearts consecrated and spirits steadied, they awaited the dawn, under a sky that watched in silence, and a God who had not forgotten the blood of the innocent. 30,000 Zulu warriors assembled on the plains of Blood River, their formation a terrifying sight, a bull in shape and spirit. 10,000 warriors surged to form the left horn, 10,000 more the right, and at the center, the seasoned heart of the army, the head of the bull, stood poised to charge with deadly force. It was a battle formation crafted not only for intimidation, but for annihilation. Against this tide of spears and shields stood 453 farmers, God-fearing men weathered by hardship, but resolute in faith. They did not place their trust in numbers, nor in the strength of their wagons, but in the Almighty. On the night before the storm, they gathered in prayer. Hands clasped, knees in the dust, voices lifted to the heavens. They made a covenant with God. If he would deliver them from their enemies, they would remember his name, pass down his greatness to their children, and build a house, be his people. On the morning of the 16th of December, 1838, the Zulu chief gave the signal for war. The command rang across the valley like a drumbeat of fate. Tens of thousands advanced with fury in their hearts and spears in hand, intent on wiping the farmers from the earth. But in the heavens another command had already been spoken. The God of heaven, who had heard the vow of his people, declared, "I will answer your covenant. You shall be a people unto me, and I will be your God." And then, unseen by mortal eyes but felt in every breath of wind, the Prince of Heaven mounted a white horse. With an army of angels behind him, he rode forth in glory. His presence went before the faithful, unseen by their foes but not unfelt. The fear of the Lord fell upon the Zulu warriors. Confusion broke their ranks. In panic and terror they turned against one another. Spears meant for the farmers pierced their own. A great silence followed the storm. Then came the still, small voice. "I have spared you, not for your strength, but that you may learn of me." On that day the covenant was sealed not just in survival, but in divine purpose. The blood-stained river bore witness, and a new identity was born, not of conquest but of calling. The Boervolk was birthed on the 16th of December 1838. In the wake of the great defeat, the Zulu people turned there upon Dingaan. The winds of loyalty shifted. The Zulu king was removed, and his half-brother became king. King Mpanda, many praised his leadership, who now sought peace with those he once called enemies. The Boervolk, once hunted, now stood as a sovereign people, with a solemn treaty forged between them and the new Zulu king. After the fallen Zulu warriors were buried with honor beneath the African soil, the land grew still. A sacred hush rested over the plains of the Natal, and there, in the fields they had prayed for and bled upon, the Boervolk walked freely, no longer fugitives but founders. After the divine miracle at Blood River, Andries Pretorius paid his respects to the fallen leader, Piet Retief. Among the scattered bones of Retief and his men, he discovered a weathered leather parchment, still intact, bearing the agreement signed with the Zulu king, granting the Boervolk rights to vast portions of Natal. It was a solemn moment, confirming both the betrayal that had taken place and the righteousness of the vow that had been fulfilled.